Now move to our next session, which is on possible priorities and outcomes in the development and climate sustainability working groups. To chair this session, we are honored to have with us India's G20 Chief Coordinator, Shri Shringla ji. As speakers, we have two extremely well-known names in the development and climate policy space. Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi, who is the Director General at RIS and is joining us online. Along with him, we have Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, who is the founder and CEO at CEEW. We also have three discussants joining us online. Well, some of them have already joined us, and some we are awaiting the others to join. We have Dr. Tetsushi Sonobe, who's the Dean and CEO, Asian Development Bank Institute. Dr. Fauziah Zen, Senior Economist, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, Indonesia. And we also have Dr. Dennis Görlich, who's the Research and Program Director, Global Solutions Initiative. Over to Vardhan Shringla ji for moderating the session. As you wish.
Namaskar and good afternoon. Let me begin by congratulating ICRIER in general and Dr. Deepak Mishra in particular for hosting this international conference in the G20 with the focus on India's G20 presidency. The subject of today's or this panel's discussion is priorities and possible outcomes of the development and climate sustainability working groups. And for this, we have very prominent experts who are going to join us. And of course, one of the reasons I readily volunteered for this assignment was that as the chair, with such a eminent lineup of some of the most prominent exponents in this field, I just have to sit back and listen to them. So I'm very happy to, of course, have Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi, Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, I believe Dr. Dennis Görlich will also join us virtually, Dr. Tetsushi Sonobe, Dr. Fauziah Zen, and very warm welcome to all of them, both in person and virtually. So, of course, development is a far better known and understood issue, and I'll speak about it a little later. But to start with the issue of the climate sustainability working group and some of the priorities there, I'll just try and put these matters in some perspective in terms, of course, India's actions, India's commitments, and where we stand as we take on this responsibility of chairing this important working group. Of course, I think most of us know that the Prime Minister's commitments, the Panch Amrit at COP26 in Glasgow, really defined our updated nationally determined contributions, which have now been submitted. But essentially, I think very far-reaching commitments in terms of climate actions, including the commitment to ensure that 50% of electric capacity was from non-fossil fuels by 2030, creating 500 gigawatts of non-renewable energy capacity by 2030, and of course, reaching net zero by 2070. In terms of our commitments, of course, we are there. But what do the others say? Of course, I think we are also familiar with the International Energy Agency's report in 2020, which really, I think, was very laudatory. India's achievements in the areas of renewable energy, in particular, the access that it had provided for citizens to electricity, affordable, efficient lighting, and clean cooking under various schemes such as Saubhagya, Ujala, and Ujjwala. And of course, it highlights the strong growth in renewables in India. I think that's very important, which at that time accounted for 23% of our total installed capacity. But it also found that the energy efficiency improvements in India avoided 15% additional energy demand in oil and gas imports, air pollution, etc. So that's, I think, quite significant. At the G7 meetings the Prime Minister attended in Germany in July, he said that India had achieved its target of 40% energy capacity from non-fossil fuel sources 9 years before time. So we have not only made commitments, we have also made sure that we have achieved those commitments, not just on time, but before time. And the target of 10% ethanol blending in petrol had been achieved 5 months before time. India was the first country to have a totally solar-powered airport, and our massive railway system would become net zero within this decade. He also highlighted the fact that we have the ability to produce in scale. The requirements that India has for climate-related technology is so significant, and the manufacturing capacity would be so large that we can produce at scale, which would make it possible for those investors to look at India as a very significant opportunity in terms of investing in clean energy technologies. More recently, just a week ago, you saw that the Prime Minister and the UN Secretary General launched Mission Life, or Lifestyle for Environment. Prime Minister pointed out the fact that we have traditionally lived in harmony with nature. And he quoted from the Atharva Ved, he said, Mata Bhumi Pitroham Prithvi, which is that the earth is our mother and we are her children. So essentially, traditionally, we have always been close to nature, and sustainable living has been something that India has practiced over time. So when he talks about Mission Life and the fact that the world needs to look at sustainable consumption, essentially what SDG 12 is already telling us, and we are looking at this factor as something that we should not only do within India, but throughout the world. So we talk about a mission life, which has pro-planet people, that is those who want to work in terms of, fostering a more sustainable lifestyle, which is very important in terms of, it goes hand in hand with climate actions. It is not just climate actions which make us achieve our goals towards mitigating climate change, but also our own lifestyles, which have to contribute towards this objective. And here, of course, the Secretary General pointed out that the Earth is we are actually consuming 1.6 times more in terms of our lifestyles than what the Earth can sustain. So we're already way beyond the sustainable levels, and we really need to look at this on a very serious mission mode capacity. What could be India's priorities for the G20 presidency, especially from the point of view of climate change and environmental aspects of the G20's discourse? And some of the options, I think, before us that we have to look at are in terms of advancing global discussions on areas like loss of biodiversity, land degradation, wasteful resources, etc., use, etc. And of course, climate resilient blue economy, encouraging resource efficiency is important. The circular economy, where the Prime Minister talked about reduce, reuse, and recycle. We have been used to a circular economy in India. All of us have been, in many senses, brought up in, I think, fostering, the use and reuse of items several times. And this is what we are really saying, that let us look at, having this on an extended basis. Protecting terrestrial ecosystems, I think that is important from the point of view of the global attention in achieving a number of the SDGs. This is something that would be possibly a priority. The crucial role played by oceans in sequestering atmospheric carbon dioxide is something that would bring us to protecting, or bring us to discussion on protecting oceans' health. We are looking at practical outcomes in certain areas, and I think we are working on some of these aspects. Protecting and conserving coastal ecosystems like mangroves, seagrass beds, salt marshes that contribute to coastal protection and marine biodiversity. And of course, sustainable and climate resilient blue economy, which is important in terms of the future growth that we're looking at, but it also has to be sustainable, and that is, I think, very important. So resource efficiency and circular economy supply chains to balance ecological footprint and biocapacity of the earth. This is, of course, directly linked to our call to build life as a campaign of positive human actions that would contribute to the betterment of the planet, while coming out with agreed principles that would define the actions that people can take to that effect. So these are some of the areas that we're looking at. Some questions I'd leave out there. Perhaps our panelists can look at how to approach these. One is, of course, a new development paradigm, and this is something that the G20 needs to look at. Development has evolved over time, the concept of development. And today, we don't only speak about social sector development, but we need to look at new and inclusive financial mechanisms through partnerships that create local resilience, harmonious societies and cultures, and sustainability going beyond GDP to explore measurement metrics that capture our aspirations holistically. These are just concepts which I am trying to see whether there is whether we can have a discussion on these. I'm not saying that these are necessarily those that are, at the top of the priority list. Obviously, why would the world need to prioritize new financing mechanisms? There has been traditionally a fragmented approach towards delivering on development. And I think it's important to look at the entire concept of financing in a different manner. And that again is a different area, but reform of some of the multilateral institutions, in particular, the multilateral financial institutions, to make them more responsive to the needs of the 21st century, the need for larger, garnering larger financing, looking at blended financing, accessing private sector finances for the purposes of supporting development, but also in also addressing the issues of insolvency and debt that many developing countries post-COVID have experienced. Access to finance, market access, and technology, been realigning growth strategies which are necessary for achieving the SDGs. The debt burden of developing countries, as I was saying, has increased, and the UN has said that the debt to gross national income ratio of developing countries has gone up from 23% to 43%, 23% in 2011 and 43% in 2022. It is a doubling of the debt burden. Inflation also has significantly increased in the decade from 2010 to 2020. This was 2.9%. Inflation today is projected to reach 6.7%. So it's a serious issue on a global basis. We're talking about a global basis. Access to development finance, therefore, assumes importance, and the role played by development financial institutions is very important in this regard, in order to bridge the SDG financing gaps to developing countries and place focus on building technical capacities, institutional capacities. Local and national governments have to be strengthened in that regard. Climate justice is an issue that has come up. I'm sure Arunabha will have something to say on that. But essentially, the commitment in Copenhagen for $100 billion a year has not materialized. Finance flows from developed countries amount to just $79.6 billion in 2019. So there is a significant gap. And the needs, I mean, if you look at our own commitments, very, very significant. It requires a lot of mobilization of finance, both domestic, but even if you mobilize domestic finance, you will need international finance to be able to achieve some of those commitments. And we are talking about developing countries needing, for a low carbon future, we are talking about a requirement from between 1.6 trillion to $3.8 trillion every year right from now to 2050. This is the IPCC's figures. So if there is any debate, the point really here is that the resource mobilization needed is huge. That's the issue. And of course, it's, the pathway towards net zero emissions remains complicated in developing countries because of lower creditworthiness, low implementation capacities, issues related to affordability, etc. So the issue of climate justice is there, and I think we need to be able to find a via media that can carry the G20 on this issue. So, can we forge a new framework for driving climate action and energy transitions while addressing our own energy security concerns? By our own, I mean, developing countries, including India. Strengthening energy transitions. Can we foster a comprehensive discussion, not just focused on the issue of coal, but all fossil fuels in a systematic and time-bound manner to a cleaner energy future? Can we look at a coalition for scaling up storage technologies? The UN Secretary General had called for such a global coalition on battery storage, for example, to fast-track innovation and development. Is that something that the G20 can facilitate? And of course, regional interconnections and green electricity trading. Prime Minister at Glasgow had spoken about one sun, one earth, one sun, one grid. Intergrid green intergrid connectivity, which I think is something that the International Solar Alliance is working on. How could we take it forward in practical terms is something that we could look at. And of course, there is a lot more that we can do, but we have, of course, a number of speakers to listen to. So let me defer to them, and then we can see how we could round this all up. Thank you. I think the first speaker is Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi, the Director General at the Research and Information Systems, RIS, and he's joining us virtually, I believe. So let me invite Dr. Chaturvedi to share his remarks with us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, sir. Thanks, Mr. Shringla, for your excellent initial remarks. You have given an overview in terms of how we look at the broad development dimension, but also, as Prime Minister has emphasized in his address, the convergence. And I think now India's G20 presidency would move in a direction where the distinction between issues that are related to climate sustainability and issues that are related to development are no more in two separate compartments. Your initial remarks have emphatically placed on table the convergence of development strategies getting completely couched in the framework with which we are addressing climate sustainable development agenda. And I think the emphasis that you have made, particularly by illustrating the point of lifestyle for environment, where Prime Minister has given a call for individual responsibility, individual agenda for global financial institutions, I think now is getting set in terms of how we look at the broad development issues which are there. And I think there are three layers of development issues that I wish to present here. First and foremost, as you very rightly emphasized, the development paradigm after the crisis of 3 Cs, we know very well, has emerged. And from that perspective, it is important for us to see how this convergence of climate and sustainability concerns brings in the kind of development nature, the development strategy that we need. And if we have to go in that direction, what are the ways we need to amend global financial architecture? And also the way we measure our development. What are the parameters? The United Kingdom's treasury was quite appropriately placed when they argued for AK Dasgupta committee that they constituted some time back. And the hefty 600-page report gave the rationale for bringing in biodiversity within the GDP calculations. And this is something I have been part of with OECD for last couple of years when we are discussing the whole issue of well-being index. So the limitations of GDP as a measurement is now being globally discussed. Our experience with COVID crisis, our experience with changing climate has re-emphasized the point in terms of what Prime Minister Modi has argued for focusing on life. Life would be best served by new measurement for our progress and our development. Our growth requires a balance, a quality growth, and the quality growth requires convergence with our environmental concerns. Sometimes when we say human-centric development, we forget other species. It has to be human-centric, but it cannot be only for humans. It is also for other species on the planet. And from that perspective, as Ambassador Shringla rightly emphasized, it has to bring in the actors. And he very rightly mentioned about blue economy. He mentioned about loss of biodiversity, and also in terms of how we bring in the climate convergence. So from that perspective, the 3 points that I have: number one, the basic treatise of the development, how we define it, I think has become important. There might be several different ways, but the development working group might think in terms of addressing this very important dimension. The second is in terms of the development finance. Again, Ambassador Shringla alluded to that. I think the role of the multilateral institutions in terms of defining how the development finance has to come up is something which is extremely important. And from that point of view, the reformed multilateral cooperation for accelerating both implementation of our global commitments, that may include several dimensions. It may include climate development. It may include the sustainable development goals. It may also include what Ambassador Shringla rightly said in terms of the climate justice. But these dimensions require a huge emphasis on adaptation measures, and that would need a renewed emphasis in terms of financing. The fact that US economy has ended up in the Q3 in the third quarter with recessionary trend, officially US may not be far behind in declaring recession. The technical definitions may give some leeway, but I think we are not very far. The recent reports in the Financial Times has made it all the more clear that we are not very far from recession, at least in the US economy. So from that perspective, how the multilateral institutions would bring in development finance, I think that would be an extremely important issue, and that would bring in the important dimension of financing of sustainable development goals. And from that perspective, the multilateral development banks, the whole idea of recapitalization of the regional development banks, and also I think the national development banks, which are now almost 53 in total, have contributed in terms of scaling up the financing that is needed for our development. And I think that's where the whole aspect of financial putting in the new frameworks is important. The new green development deal, which is being discussed all across, I think requires a bit of convergence. As I said in the beginning, the convergence now, which probably India's leadership as Prime Minister's statement, along with the Secretary General of the UN, with the dedication of life came in, it shows a clear roadmap for this convergence. And that I think would require revisiting the way we look at the data for development. And this, I think, is something which requires the right indicators, the right parameters to come in. It may also be evident in terms of the public goods that we are creating, and also the way we are looking at the new dimensions, and I think new technologies. The fact that the Sustainable Development Goals created TFM, the Technology Facilitation Mechanism, it would pave way for leveraging science, technology, innovation for delivering on SDGs. And I think this would create a new stream for our understanding and knowledge. And that's where we are not very far in terms of how we look at the role of the digital technologies for inclusion, they for our development, and also in terms of how we connect some of these dimensions with the questions of ethics which are related to global financing, but ethics which are also related to technology. Their dimensions of artificial intelligence connect, their dimensions with our emphasis on source and the data, which has direct bearing on India's positioning for the TRIPS exemption for the vaccine that was relevant for COVID, but even otherwise is something that is to be decided and taken in. I see that I'm left with only 1 minute. The last point that I want to emphasize is in terms of looking into the whole question of how the development working group actually connects the other streams which are important from the financing perspective, particularly from industrialization perspective. So countries that have their GDP dominant with agriculture are now being encouraged to come out as they move towards net zero. And that requires adaptation of new technologies for reducing methane production from their rice or the paddy fields. And this requires transition. The economies that are into manufacturing or are going towards creating value chains for industrial production would also have to follow low carbon strategy. So from that point of view, again, you need to think as to what the climate goals are and how we fund the development. So these are broad three objectives that I think are important in terms of how India's new strategy with the development working group during Indian presidency would take it forward. I have exhausted my time before compelling chair to give me a reminder. I would very much like to stop here, but I'm there for any clarification or questions out there. Thanks, Ambassador Shringla, for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chaturvedi, for joining us all the way from Mumbai and for your very valuable remarks. Let me now call upon Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, founder and CEO of Council on Energy, Environment and Water, of course, who needs no introduction.
Thank you, Ambassador Shringla. Good afternoon, and thank you to ICRIER for inviting me for this dialogue. And of course, many thanks to Sachin for articulating the priorities as he sees it for the Development Working Group. I think the way Sachin started off is absolutely right, that the issues of climate change and sustainability on one hand, and development on the other are no longer really separate tracks or separate working groups. We have to see at least at an intellectual level, how they intersect. And then we see how we can weave in the different ideas and the priorities that we are referring to into the different working groups within the G20. So in my presentation, I will try and look at these strategic links between energy, development, climate, and sustainability. In a way, that's exactly how we operate at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We look at our system-level transformations for the economy, for the power sector, and so forth. But we also look at issues of the here and now, the challenges of the quality of life, whether it's air, water, food. And then we, of course, look at the enablers, the finance, the technology, but also the new ways of improving cooperation within and outside the country. So where do we stand today? Let me start with that. Before we get into solutions, it's good to have a diagnosis. And of course, the Sherpa in the morning, rather late night for him outlined very clearly that we were in a fractured world, to use his words. I'm just starting off with a simple equation which has no numbers on it. There's SDGs minus global shocks, which has led us to a net negative situation for the planet. And we are halfway into the SDG agenda, where we are regressing on many of the goals, and this has nothing to do with just climate action. We have over 100 million people who have gone back into poverty. But it's not one global shock. We've got a global shock of a continuing fever. We've got a global shock in terms of the pandemic. We have a global shock in terms of finance, of fuel and the energy crisis, and of course, food. And these global shocks are then compounded further by rising climate risks. And those are not far out in the future. They're not even far out into the near future. They're very much here and now, which is impacting not just human security, it is impacting food security. Let me just give an example. The largest exporters of wheat from Europe, you perhaps know, are Russia and Ukraine. But guess who's the third largest producer or exporter of wheat? It's France. And France has had a major shock to its wheat output this year, thanks to major heat waves. So when we start thinking about the geopolitical shocks and the climate shocks, you see how it begins to impact. Infrastructure losses. India, just in the last 5 years, has lost about $7 billion in terms of extreme weather events. And I would say this is an undercounting of the kind of impact. But then this results in fiscal pressures. Let's take a state like Odisha. Odisha is expending this year $130 million on climate action. But it has had to allocate more than $500 million to deal with disasters. So these are, I'm just giving these as individual examples of how they compound into creating these policy and action sort of conundrums for us. The third challenge of where we stand is energy security. Insecurity continues to rise. And it's not about oil, gas, or coal alone. The problem is that we neither have the finance for the energy technologies of the future, nor are we co-developing the energy technologies of the future, nor are we governing the energy technologies of the future. It is now nearly 50 years since we had one major energy shock that resulted in a cartel of suppliers and a cartel of demanders. But today, when you look at the energy technologies of the future, whether it's solar or batteries that Ambassador Shringla referred to, or even strategic industrial fuels like green hydrogen, we have no rules to govern them. Nor are we talking or listening, to use Mr. Myra's favorite phrase, to the economies that are going to use these fuels. So we need a completely different paradigm. We also need a paradigm of industrialization decarbonization without deindustrialization. The D is missing there. But in a way, my faux pas there is also the faux pas we are all making in a way. We are assuming that just because we need to decarbonize, that we should automatically suppress our industrial development strategies. And that's why the fifth major conundrum is that just transition is not just a phase down of fossil fuel infrastructure. It is actually a call for jobs, growth, and sustainability. But we don't have that paradigm today. So in the remainder of my time, I'm going to spend a little bit of time. I changed my spectacles recently, and I'm going to guarantee you that you will have to change your spectacles soon after I present these slides, because we wanted to look at, if we have to come up with a new paradigm of development, what has the G20 history been looking at in terms of some of these issues? So these slides will be shared, but what I really wanted to just highlight is that over the past 6, 7, 8 years, my colleagues at CEEW have been plotting what are the issues that the G20 has been discussing. The dark greens are the kinds of what are the high impact outcomes that you get out of a G20 process. You get action items, you get principles, and the lighter greens are sometimes it is the head nodding towards issues of concern. But if you look at it, don't get into the details. G20 has discussed climate change, ecosystem preservation, land degradation and restoration, ocean-based action, marine litter. In some of these, where I've highlighted the text in blue, we've got some concrete moves to move forward. Similarly, some of the issues, again, Ambassador Shringla talked about circular economy or bioeconomy. We talked about agriculture, sustainable agriculture, food security, all different themes within G20, fishing, water resources, even sustainable lifestyles have been discussed. Of course, life as a mission had not been announced. We've also discussed in the G20 ever since 2014, industry transition. So that whole decarbonization without deindustrialization story has unfolded in terms of a sustainable and inclusive growth for industries, the type of quality infrastructure, what are those low carbon emissions technologies, thinking about supply chains. We're not thinking about supply chains only in the last 2 years. It's been going on for a while. The focus on small businesses, and of course, the continuing focus on finance and investment or lack thereof. And then, of course, there are sustainable development priorities that go into even larger sets of issues, employment, resource mobilization, innovation, inclusive business, and so forth. What I'm trying to say here is that if we have to make the world a better place, we have to ask ourselves, how can I, or how can we as countries or members of the G20 actually contribute to that rich history of actions, or at least calls for action, into what Sherpa said this morning, an action-oriented, outcome-oriented G20 for India. And hence my last couple of slides. I'm going to talk about both the Climate Sustainability Working Group and the Development Working Group, although Dr. Chaturvedi has already referred to it. And many of these issues Ambassador Shringla brought up. My name, Arunabha, actually means first rays of the rising sun, but I can assure you my work on solar does not mean it's the last rays of climate action. And in a way, this focus on development, energy security, climate action, sustainability, actually means we have to go beyond the vanilla investments in just solar and wind to think about the much richer space for not just changing our lifestyles, but changing our economic paradigms and even business models. Hence, there's likely, when we've been working with the ministries on reducing land degradation. This is something India had committed to in 2019 when it hosted the COP for desertification, but also how we can enhance the G20 goal towards degraded land, not just because it helps with agriculture, but it's because of a major sink for carbon. But also, as Sachin referred to, a habitat for other species, not just a human-centric paradigm. Similarly, the focus on oceans. Many economies are looking at marine or the blue economy, but also to think not just on the lives and livelihoods dependent on the oceans, but also use an ecosystem-based approach for both climate mitigation and adaptation co-benefits. But in order to do that, you need to create platforms and partnerships. And that's where we go beyond just individual actions to the enabling of markets. How do you create an economy around circularity? How do you create circular economy unicorns? How do you create circular bioeconomy solutions? Even take an old but strategic industry like steel, which accounts for a significant share of industrial emissions. And how can we have a more sustainable pathway? These are just examples of how partnerships and platforms can be created. And similarly, in the Development Working Group, some of the mantras that are in my mind are, first, we need trillions for the billions. Majority of the world's population lives in the global south, 5.5 to 6 billion people. And the trillions that Ambassador Shringla referred to is clearly not going towards them. So we need not just de-risking and blended finance as nice rhetorical statements, but we need de-risking at scale to crowd in private investment. Equally, we need to move the energy transition closer to people. I mentioned just transition is not just decarbonizing or moving away from fossil infrastructure. It is about jobs, growth, and sustainability. Let me give you an example. Distributed energy used for livelihoods and small businesses in India is a $53 billion market, billion with a B. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's an $11 billion market just in the farm sector. In Southeast Asia, another huge market. But these are small projects, disaggregated. It's people, not hard infrastructure, not big capital, so they're not on our radar. But if we have to converge climate action, energy security, energy access, sustainable development, and development as we understand it, we need the trillions to flow to the billions. Similarly, we have an Agenda 2030 in the form of the SDGs. but clearly we don't have an action agenda. How do we accelerate progress on the SDGs? That first equation I showed you, SDGs minus global shocks, is net negative for the planet. So we need to mobilize resources for Agenda 2030. And equally, we've got to prevent the other side. We've got to reduce the impact of those global shocks. So can we create a resilience fund, a reserve fund to serve as an insurance for the most vulnerable? Third dimension, how do we secure, as I mentioned earlier, the energy fuels of the future in a rules-based form? So what are the rules that would govern the energy demanders of the past and the energy demanders of the future for the energy fuels of the future? And how do we co-develop the technologies with de-risking of technologies? And that then brings us to lifestyle for environment, embedding it in SDG 12 as a global movement, not just to nudge individual behavior, but to enable markets around circularity and redefine our aspirations. And that then leads to what we could think of as a Green Deal for development. Now, those slides that made you forced you to change your spectacles are in that Christmas tree of all the things that are on a G20 agenda. And I've just, put them under one thing called the hygiene and wish list. But then if we actually think about this action-oriented G20 that India aspires to, as the Sherpa said this morning, then how do those issues serve as not just high priorities for an emerging economy like India, but also a broader agenda for the G20? And that's why right on top is the financing story around the climate agenda and the financing story around the SDGs overall. The framing around lifestyles, not just as a feel-good issue, but as a driver of new circularity, and a framing around a deal for green development. And then we can get into the partnerships, whether it's oceans or land or technologies for tomorrow or circular economies and so forth. But that is the kind of hierarchy around which we can organize our thoughts and listen to each other and create a platform that not just adds more things to the Christmas tree, but actually helps us open some presents. Thank you.
Thank you, Arunabha, for a most informative presentation, but also for all the ideas that we have for our presidency that you've given us. We have, unfortunately, a hard stop at 2:50, and we still have our 3 discussants, so I'd have to request them to confine their interventions to about 8 minutes each. Let me call upon Dr. Tetsushi Sonobe to give us perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. So, can you hear me?
Yes, you're very audible. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, it's really a great honor and a pleasure to participate in this annual G20 conference. And I'm really privileged to be part of this panel consisting of distinguished policy makers and researchers. And taking this opportunity, I'd like to thank ICRIER for the partnership with ADBI for many years for various collaborations. And I'd like to thank Chairman Shri Shringla and Dr. Sachin, Chaturvedi, and Dr. Ghosh for very clear, inspiring, and insightful arguments. I wonder what comment I can make, but maybe because my organization ADBI is going to host Think 7 think tank engagement group of G7 as part of G7 Japan 2023. Even though ADB Institute is a multilateral organization, but the Japanese government requested kindly trust us to be kind of host or co-chair of T7. And then the doctors, Sachin, Chaturvedi, and I have been talking many times about the kind of collaboration between Think 20 and Think 7. And our hope is to nicely bridge G7 and G20. And then today, this panel's arguments did not much mention about the collaboration between G7 and the rest of the G20. So, of course, the G7 discuss important issues building upon the results of G20. And then I think vice versa. So that kind of collaboration is very important. And then the three examples come to my mind very quickly. So one is debt crisis issue and also the reverse flow of capital from middle-income countries or emerging market economies. But that was nicely addressed in the previous session, especially by Dr. Poonam Gupta's nice presentation. So I skip this. And then other two related to the one is food insecurity, and the other is, of course, sustainable finance. About food insecurity. So G7 Germany 2022 did great job. It has put the focus on the global food insecurity and the nutrition crisis unleashed by the war in Ukraine, with the most severe impacts falling upon vulnerable populations in low and middle income countries. Last May, two G7 meetings produced 4 separate communiques, and the G7-led Global Alliance for Food Security was announced. The G7 foreign ministers made 14 communiques, made global food security for the most vulnerable a top foreign policy objective. And the G7 agricultural ministers offer concrete financial and technical support to the G20 agriculture market information system. The G7 development ministers communique provided even more specifics and ambition and committed to a robust immediate response to the crisis alongside long-term strategies. So another important support by the G7 Germany is a long-term alliance called Zero Hunger Coalition, which aims at eliminating hunger by 2030. So these commitments by G7 are very nice, and they are hoped to turn into action. And the action is hoped to bear fruits. But to this end, I think the cooperation of the other G20 countries will be critically important. And in addition, hunger is just one of many challenges faced by the global agriculture and food systems. Because, agriculture, forest, and other land use sector is responsible for nearly a quarter of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And agriculture is also the largest user of water resources and the key polluter of water bodies through nitrogen and phosphate leakages, and the biggest threat to biodiversity. And additionally, this sector is seriously suffering from the effect of climate change, while it is uniquely able to sequester large amount of carbon in biomass and in the soils and create sustainable landscapes and biodiversity. As to socio-economic sustainability, about 70 or 80% of the poor and of the food insecure households are smallholder farm families. So the demand for food is now huge because of the 9.1 million people in 2050. So to meet this growing food demand and to support decarbonization, sustainable and nutritious food production, and also non-food bioeconomy need to increase significantly its production. And the trade in agriculture need to become more crisis-proof. At the same time, the food losses along the value chains and consumption patterns have to change to dampen the needs for production increase. So sustainability has to be improved at production, processing, trade, and consumption levels of this kind of cycle of food production and consumption system. So G20 can do a lot, building upon this G7's achievement, and then G20 can, can be a very important player to turn the G7's commitment into fruitful action. And then in terms turning to the sustainable finance, so on the one hand, there is an urgent need to massively scale up sustainable finance through investment in climate resilient infrastructure, low carbon technologies, and other areas to achieve the SDGs and the just transition. On the other hand, the financial system needs to stop financing companies that engage in harmful activities that worsen environmental degradation and the climate crisis, and undermine the achievement of the internationally agreed sustainability goals. So there is a prevalent problem in finance with greenwashing, that is the practice of providing misleading claims of the supposed environmental impact of financial assets. Moreover, while a growing number of financial institutions have pledged to align their portfolios with net zero finance, but finance continues to flow into areas that are clearly undermining the climate goals. So global financial institutions also continue to fund activities that drive deforestation and land use change, major sources of global carbon emissions, and important drivers of biodiversity loss. So, and unfortunately, many of the financial institutions funding fossil fuel exploitation or deforestation globally are headquartered in G7 countries. So here is a big space for G20. The rest of the G20 help G7 and work together to achieve very, very important sustainable finance. And so these are just two issues related to the development working group and the climate change working group. But I think there are huge space for the very fruitful collaboration between G7 and G20. And hopefully T20 India and the T7 Japan collaborate to help G7 to bridge G7 and the G20. Let me stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Sonobe. we apparently have just about 13 minutes left for our session. So what I would have to request the other two speakers is to really make very brief comments, maybe about 4 minutes each, so that we have a couple of minutes, for Q&A. So apologies for this, but please, Dr. Fauziah Zen, let me invite you, who's a senior economist, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, based in Indonesia. Please do make your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Thank you for ICRIER to invite me as a representative from area. I think many of the important issues are already well covered by the previous panelists and speakers. So I like to I have a couple of comments, to reiterate and also to add some important issues that I thought India can carry. First, that on the our world paths on the reaching climate change mitigation and adaptation Paris Agreement, agree that we need to revisit the NDCs and look at the updates of the NDCs, also our global commitments. Because we can see that if we look at the implementation gaps across the countries, I think we need to also identify why is the reasons of the implementation gaps, because I think some of the reasons are preventable. Actually, it can be done with the global supports. So I'm more on the besides we call for the developing economies commitment, we need also to push more to develop countries' responsibility for this climate change agenda. So that one, the first point. The second one is the financings that already mentioned a lot today. First, that on the sources, I think that 100 billion is not broken down into the sources of the finance. So this is actually a bit weakness. Typically, the less clear responsible party, then the less commitment will meet, because they suggest 100 billions come from the advanced country Annex 1 in the COP, and the sources come from individual countries as well as private sectors. So everybody can say that I'm done with my responsibilities, but let's other do that. So I think we need more details and strengthen these commitments from the developed economies on the climate change pledge, financing pledge. Also exploring the ways and mechanism to do that. Agree on Dr. Sachin's suggestions on evaluate the global financial architecture, to facilitate what we really need to do, to channeling these financial sources, especially from the international commitments to the needy in the developing countries. For example, do we need some decision support tools, or how to scaling up the successful stories on the implementations in developing economies. And also that we need also to look at the inverse impacts on the climate change adaptation policies, such as already described by Dr. Ghosh very well, how to compensate or minimize the bad impact of these transitions, especially for the poor and marginal groups. And the third point is, I know that the awareness of the climate change threats is already already quite high, recently. But I think we still need to link this climate change with other global critical issues, especially in food energy security, global health, infrastructure disruptions, connectivity, poverty, and trade disruptions. It's also related with Dr. Sachin's convergence global issues. Yeah, so these cross sectors issues can be amplified to raise the awareness of this climate change adaptation. And that's all my point actually, but let me add 2 points on India's strategic role in this G20 presidency. India is a big economy, is linked globally, and India is really well in representing developing economies' interests. So with this troika, yeah, Indonesia, India, and next year, and the next is Brazil, three developing economies in a row as the presidency in G20. I think India will play important role to bring important message. Yeah, and the next one is how India, as a president of the G20 2023, can intensify this G20 message to G7 and other international organizations like OECD or EU, yeah, especially on the developed economies' responsibilities to the sustainable development and climate change adaptations. Already mentioned also by Dr. Tetsushi Sonobe. So that's my comment. I think I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Fauziah Zain. Can I call upon Dr. Dennis Görlich, Research and Program Director, Global Solutions Initiative? We really are running out of time, so just a couple of minutes to really round up and give us your brief comments. Thank you.
Yes.
We are not hearing you, Dr. Dennis Görlich. I don't know if you can hear us.
Well, thank you for the invitation to this important conference, and I'm sure
We have a slightly garbled line, so we're not able to.
India will make a very significant contribution. Can you hear me well?
We are not able to hear you clearly. It's
Okay.
inaudible.
Okay,
Can you speak again?
I put off my video now. Is that better now?
Yes, it's better. We can hear you. Please go
Okay,
ahead.
I'm very sorry. Okay, I'll be very brief. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation here, and I'll be very brief with my comment. I would basically just like to alert you of one thing. One point I have heard several times throughout the presentations was that there is an urgent need to integrate development paradigms, development action with climate action. And I suppose that one important prerequisite to do that is how we measure progress among various dimensions, not only economically, but also how is the state of the natural world, and also how is prosperity in the society developing. And I'm mentioning this because we at the Global Solutions Initiative, and also at the New Institute, where I'm also running a program, we have started a larger scale initiative on doing research and policy efforts to make progress with the measurement agenda. So what do I mean by that? What we have developed is a framework that we call SAGE, S-A-G-E. So it's not only material gain, that's the G, that's important for societies around the world, but also environmental prosperity, that's the E, and also social prosperity. That's solidarity in particular and agency. So how well embedded are people in their societies, and how much can they actually make progress, or can they determine the fate of their lives by shaping their lives? That's agency. One big problem with that is that these things are hard to measure, and we have started an initiative to really make progress to measure these other dimensions of well-being, to make them available for usage as a compass for policymakers all around the world, and also to use them to evaluate policies. Now, talking about integrating climate action and development paradigms, I think that having some clarity on how do we define progress, and taking on a little bit broader perspective on how progress should be defined is an important aspect here. Then I would like to reiterate what Tetsushi has mentioned, that the G7 and the G20 should be collaborating on these issues. I think there have been a few important initiatives, as Tetsushi has mentioned, in Germany, which I'm sure Japan will carry on to work on. The Climate Club agenda is one issue that has been proposed by Germany's G20 that clearly needs to be extended beyond G20, and where I hope that also India with the G20 presidency can work together to make this to develop this agenda further. I think in the interest of time, I'll stop here, and I'm very sorry for these connection issues.
Thank you, Dr. Görlich. And I think we seem to have run out of time. So we had a question and answer session that was scheduled, but in the interest of time, we'll have to do away with that. I just want to briefly, thank all of our participants. I think we've had some excellent inputs today, some very good ideas. Some of the thoughts that stayed with us, of course, is the strong link today between development, climate actions and the environment. And I think, we really need to look at how we have to approach these issues. How do we integrate development actions with climate actions? How do we look at separate working groups working in closer synergy and producing results that are really comprehensive in nature. The other issue, of course, is climate financing, which I think has really was touched upon by all the speakers. And clearly, this is an important issue in our forthcoming presidency of the G20. There are many other issues, but I see that we have a hard stop when time has run out. So thank you very much for bearing. Thank you for all of our discussions and participants. Thank you so much.